So welcome everybody, thank you for coming quite early on a Sunday morning. It's a privilege to be here. My name is Claire Chambers. I'm a lecturer at the University of York, and I actually work on post-colonial literature, which is the topic of today. But I think we'll also have a more free-flowing conversation because I really want you to know more about these two amazing writers that we have today. So just to introduce both our speakers, Jamal Mahjoub is a Sudanese English writer and novelist. He was born in London and grew up in Khartoum, Sudan. He won the Guardian African Short Story Prize in 1991 for the cartographer's Angel, and the 2004 French Prix de l'Astrolabe for his novel The Carrier, 1998. He writes in English, and 3 of his novels have been translated into Arabic: Wings of Dust, 1994, Traveling with Jinns, 2003, and In the Hour of Signs, 1996. He lives in Holland. Maha Phillips is a multiple award-winning financial journalist and the author of Beautiful from This Angle, The Curse of Mohenjo-Daro, and The Mystery of Agni Ruby. She grew up in Karachi. She has a bachelor's degree in politics and international relations and a master's in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent at Canterbury. In 2006, she completed a master's degree in creative writing from City University in London, where she currently lives with her husband and son. Her son is here. And I think I've actually done kind of old bios because I haven't been on the Wi-Fi. But there's lots more exciting things to tell you about these writers, and I hope that will come out in the discussion. So I thought I could start by asking you both what you think of when you think of post-colonial literature, which we are asked to talk about, and if you feel that this category applies to your writing. Jamal?
Good morning. I think it used to apply to my writing. Post-colonialism, I think when I started writing, I was conscious of the idea of addressing history, trying to tell the stories from our side as opposed to the stories from the colonizers' side, and that seemed to be a valid project. And I wrote, I guess, my first 3 or 4 novels in that sort of vein. I kind of feel now that things have moved on from there, and that post-colonialism doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people, and that we are perhaps in what could be described as a post-colonial phase, perhaps if only because of the existence of a kind of general amnesia, that people are really no longer aware of history or of a need to address history. And, okay, is that better? Okay. Speaking the mic a bit, yeah, okay. So I think that's really what the situation. I think that our connection to the idea of where, for example, the problems, for example, if we talk specifically about Sudan, the problems that we face in Sudan today are partly, yes, they emerge from the period of colonial authority, but a lot of, you can't really say that the last, the 40 years of civil war, and I think a lot of things that we've seen are self-created and need to be addressed from within. And I think also that the world has moved on in some respect. I think there is a kind of numbers change, there's a demographic change. The West is no longer simply the West as it used to be, and I think that in some ways the post-colonial conversation, if there is one that's going on, it has to be within the West, in the sense that it is the West that is still struggling to deal with the colonial past that it has never felt it had to deal with, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Maha?
Well, I think what you said is really interesting, particularly about history and the importance of history. And for me, growing up, Indian writers were particularly successful, and there were some notable works. And I remember growing up and reading Salman Rushdie, and I was probably too young to try and read Salman Rushdie, but I thought, oh, I want to write, but I'm never going to write like Salman Rushdie, so I can't write, I guess. Because I thought books that came out of the subcontinent, would be full of magical realism and discuss kind of events of historical significance, and later on would just look at mangoes and spices and all those lovely things, exotic colors. And so I actually struggled with that for a while. I wasn't sure where that left me. And then I think it was quite liberating, because sort of another generation of writers came up, and they were doing really interesting things and different things, and it opened up the scope to do something that I felt more comfortable writing about, and more, that made it more accessible for me to become a writer from this region.
I think that if we all tried to write like Salman Rushdie, we would all give up. It's kind of hopeless. But I think that Amit Chaudhry has also written quite a lot about the difficulty he had in realizing, in struggling to find his voice, and in the face of the way that Salman Rushdie was taken and perceived as being the voice of the subcontinent, And I think that he, in his own quiet way, went in another direction.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think what's amazing and lovely now is that we have this whole plethora, particularly of Pakistani writers, that are doing all kinds of really fun, interesting, different things, and all genres. And I don't think we had that, 15 years ago. So it's really fantastic.
And I think the good thing is that somehow we have been liberated from history in that sense, that there isn't the need now. And I think I see this also in African writing, that there isn't the need now to actually feel that you have to address history, that you can't, and in some ways it's a liberation that comes from, it comes from a kind of position of privilege in a way, because I think a lot of the writers that we see, particularly the African writers, have left Africa and are living in the US or in Europe, and are doing creative writing courses or whatever it is. But they've liberated themselves from Africa in some way, and African literature has, in that sense, been liberated from the sense of history, which I think is a good thing, up to a certain point. And I think that it's very good in the sense that, as you're describing, that it kind of liberates the idea of the literature, so people can feel that they can write about anything.
Yeah.
And so we get stories that really do come from an entirely different substrata in the consciousness.
So in a way, what you're both pointing to is that in the early days of post-colonial writing, there was an issue of form, like magical realism in Rushdie's vein was very popular, and there's a whole generation of writers who maybe cut their teeth with talking animals and flying carpets and whatever. Also a sort of formal writing back to the canon, rewriting classics like Shakespeare or Jane Austen, and that still exists today. But you're also pointing to changes in content. I mean, Jamal, you mentioned the word post-colonial. So you said, we don't necessarily need to write about history, but both of you have also dealt with historical topics. Your writing is quite broad. You've both got very contemporary subjects, and you've both looked back to earlier centuries. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your relationship and your works with history. Maybe we'll start with Maha, because The Curse of Mohenjo-Daro has, I don't know, four millennia? It's huge.
So The Curse of Mohenjo-Daro came about because I've always loved the Indus Valley civilization. It's been a passion of mine, and it's one of those areas where, I don't know how many of you went on school trips to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and all these amazing places, but we never celebrate these places. Or, and if you go abroad and you talk about Mohenjo-Daro, it's just blank. Nobody knows what you're talking about. And I just loved this civilization. I think it just got into my bones, so I've always wanted to write about it. And one day, and it will betray both my age and also how long I've been thinking about this, when there was first dial-up internet. And it was the days where internet was so cool that you would just spend hours just looking up things, just because it was such a fun thing to do. And I was using the dial-up internet and looking up Mohenjo-Daro, and I came across all these kind of conspiracy theories about the age and about what happened there and how the civilization vanished. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a great opportunity or thing to write a thriller about. But too bad we don't have any thrillers in Pakistan. And I sort of put it aside, and at that time I wasn't writing. And then later I came back to it, and I thought, why not? Why not set a thriller in this amazing place? And I wanted to kind of examine what happened to the people there, why they vanished, why the civilization declined over time, what might it look like if it had existed. And then I got stuck because I think it's the journalist in me. I got crippled and said, oh, there's not enough information out here. I can't write about this because I don't know enough. There's not enough research. And only 10% of the place has been excavated. And then it was a writer friend of mine, the fantastic Kamla Shamsi, who said, you should use that as a liberating point. Because the fact that you don't know anything means no one is going to know anything. And let your imagination run wild. So it ended up turning into speculative fiction a little bit. And I described my own world.
Jamal, I think you've written about 17th century Denmark amongst other historical topics.
Yeah, no, I think that, I didn't mean to suggest that history is not relevant. I think history is more relevant than ever, and I think that we need to keep going back and examining it. And but I think that somehow, for me, the writing project became separated from that formal post-colonial kind of writing that, Type Saleh or Chinua Achebe or, so forth. It wasn't about redressing colonial history in some way. And I think that what I think happened is that there was a kind of liberation from the idea of the nation in the writing. And so when I wrote The Carrier, for example, I was fascinated by the idea of heliocentrism and astronomy. And I had been to a conference in Denmark where somebody stood up and said the reason we find it so difficult to integrate Muslims or migrants from Muslim countries into our country is because for 1,000 years we've had no contact with that part of the world. And this conference was taking place in an archaeological museum in which there were literally, right next to this man speaking, Arab coins that had been brought back a couple of centuries earlier. So people don't know their own history, and this led me to this idea of what the connection could be between, and it was speculative fiction, but it was based on this moment in time when the technology changed, and you suddenly had the technology to be able to make lenses. So I wrote a story about a telescope, and about a man coming from North Africa to find a telescope, and ending up shipwrecked, and everything goes wrong, of course. But after I'd finished writing that novel, weirdly, they discovered some lenses from about the same period just across the water from Denmark in the south of Sweden.
Wow.
So that was speculative fiction, which then was, echoed by reality. So don't give up on history.
Amazing.
I like this idea that you've been liberated from the idea of the nation, and I think that's something that cuts across both your oeuvres, because I think your fictions are very hard to contain within national boundaries. I mean, we've mentioned Denmark and Sweden there. There's obviously Britain in your writing, other parts of Europe, there's Sudan and Egypt and other parts of Africa. And for you, Pakistan is there, but the US, Britain, and various parts of Pakistan and various regions. So I wonder if you could both talk about the mobility of your fiction, which might be a growing sort of trend, I think, in post-colonial writing, this kind of border crossing and transnationalism. Maybe Jamal to start.
Yeah, well, I think that's also, if you look back at the books that I've done, I think there is a kind of progression towards that. And I think it's partly because my original subject, I felt, was Sudan. But after several years of living outside Sudan, I began to feel that the real stories about what was going on in the present in Sudan were being written by Sudanese writers who were living in Sudan. And that my subject was really out there. It was this process of moving around through the world. and discovering connections and links and this kind of, yes, transnational kind of existence that you come into. It doesn't mean that the nationalism or the fate of Sudan didn't matter to me anymore. It did, and it came back to me in the book that I've just done, which is A Line in the River, which is a non-fiction book and which is about going back to Sudan. But the fiction that I've done is mostly been connected to where I was last, not where I am now. I mean, I never seem to write about the places that I'm in. So, and I've written a series of books detective novels set in Cairo, which are looking at trying to document or document the build-up towards the Arab Spring of 2011. And I'm kind of a little over halfway through that. So that's kind of a big project.
Yeah, I should have said this in the introduction. I was very remiss because I had the wrong introduction. But Jamal also writes under the name Parker Bilal, and they're brilliant crime novels. So one of the things, we'll come on to that later, but I wanted just to interject. And let's have Maha talk about mobility and transnationalism.
I mean, I agree with Jamal. I think partly it's because there are so many Pakistani writers who live in Pakistan who are doing amazing work and examining many of the issues that take place here. And partly it's because I've lived in different places, and I think that just informs your work. And in terms of developing a voice, I mean, I don't feel like I can speak to what is happening in Pakistan today. I could have maybe 10 years ago. And so it sort of means that I address what my experiences are and my locations are, and yeah.
What I was going to say is in The Golden Scales, the crime novel of yours that I've read, which I thoroughly enjoyed, there's a section where there's a gated community. It really stuck with me about this sort of the way people, the privileged, sort of cut themselves off from the outside. And I feel like that your discussion in Beautiful from this angle of very sort of elite Karachi people and the kind of disconnect with the rural life, I thought there was definitely some connection there. So I wonder.
I think that's. Yeah. Well, I think that's the way we're going, and I think that if you look at, I think we've moved beyond. I think the whole idea of nationalism and nationality is changing, in the sense that in the nation state is of course quite a modern invention, and perhaps it's outlived its time to some degree. I think what we're seeing in Europe today with, for example, the whole thing about Britain leaving the European Union is an interesting kind of response to actually what is happening in the world, which is that people are forming larger communities and larger sort of networks, which are kind of inevitable and have been going on for some time. But there's a kind of resistance to that. There's a kind of wanting to cling to the old ways, which is kind of explains to some extent what's the phenomenon, Trump and Brexit and so on. But I think that we live in a kind of transnational world, and I think to some extent the kind of position that I'm in is that I kind of feel that I should use my position of mobility as a kind of bridge. So if and I think that the kind of writing that is the idea that they used to exist, that there was a kind of periphery centered in the West, and then there is a center in the West, and then there's a peripheries around the world. That's changed. That you now have, for example, in Pakistan, a very rich literature scene that is growing, and you have this in different parts of the world at the same time. And this is all feeding back into what's happening at the center in some way. And so that is, I think, very interesting. And that's really kind of completely into this sort of transnational kind of existence. And the important thing is to allow those other voices, like these voices that these writers that I know who are writing in Sudan and writing in Arabic, whose work is gradually coming slowly out, and so we're getting more and more voices coming through.
Yeah, and I just want to just to make clear, I was talking about writers writing in English, not in Urdu, where we've already had this rich tradition.
Yeah, translation is a
writing,
really big issue, a really big barrier, I think, particularly with somewhere like Sudan.
And here,
Yeah.
You mentioned a line in the river. I want to ask you about the title and whether it alludes to a bend in the river, Naipal, but also more generally, I know that, Maha, you're moving into non-fiction, and A Line in the River is about Khartoum, isn't it? So I wonder if you could talk about this decision for you both in your most current work to do non-fiction. Maha, maybe you could start by telling the audience what you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Mine was an accidental move into nonfiction. So I was sick a few years ago, and I met this kind of very interesting maverick doctor who works both in Brazil and in London, and is a kind of barefoot GP in the sense that he goes off and works on the edges of the rainforest in Brazil, and then comes and has this posh private practice in London. And he was just so interesting and so dynamic, and of course helped me get better. And we decided to collaborate on a project. So we're working on a book that's coming out in October called 50 Tips for the Over 50s. And it's really about kind of the quirky medicinal therapies that you can do that conventional medicine doesn't really look at. Just small things to make big changes. And so it was just an evolution that way. We're going to be working on a few other things as well in terms of health. But it's a pause. I'm going back to fiction.
You never know. The medicine might really take off, because that sounds like that's something people are interested in. And my book was simply, my parents left Sudan after the regime, after Omar al-Bashir arrived in 1989, about a year later. My father was working for a newspaper that was shut down, and the two main editors were, one of them went to prison and one of them left the country, and my father was advised to leave, and so he did, and he was able to do that, and they moved to Cairo. And they stayed there. My father passed away, and he never went back to Sudan. And I had always felt that going back to Sudan while, this was kind of wishful thinking, I can't go back while Omar al-Bashir is still there, while the regime is still there, because my father refused to go back. But then, Darfur came along and kept getting more serious, and I felt really that people were focused on the wrong thing, and that really Darfur fitted into a particular pattern of violence between the state against the people that had been happening in Sudan for many years. And so I wanted to go there and to write about that. And I arrived in Khartoum after having been away for about 16 years, and had no idea what to expect. I had no idea, if anybody was there, that I'd lost contact with most people. I discovered this city that I had grown up in, and I had discovered family and friends, people that I hadn't seen for years, and I realized that the real subject was not Darfur. Darfur is a symptom. The real problem is in Khartoum, and so I wanted to write about the two things: rediscovering Khartoum and trying to analyze what had happened in Sudan over all of these years since independence to lead us to this point in time, which happened to be just around the time of the referendum that led to secession and the breakaway of South Sudan. So it became a project that just, it started with one trip and then another trip and then another trip, and then I was taking notes and trying to think, how do I put all this together? How do I make sense of all this? So the whole project took me 10 years from the beginning to publication. And I really, by the end of it, I just didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep going. And then, eventually I just felt that, it had to end with secession and the breakup of the country. Yeah. Seemed like the end of it, Do
you still go back a lot?
I go back. I was there a couple of months ago, just before the price rises went up and the riots started.
Yeah. So also sticking with genre, you've played with genres in your two novels. You said before that when you were thinking about Mohenjo-Daro, you thought at the time there were no Pakistani thrillers, but now there are quite a few, and yours is a brilliant example of one of them. But even in Beautiful from this angle, there are elements of chick lit, and you do a little parody, or quite a very funny but biting satire on the Muslim misery memoir. And then we've touched on your non-fiction, your crime fiction, but I wonder if there are any other genres that you're interested in, Jamal.
Well, I mean, genres, yeah, no. I mean, I have dabbled in science fiction or whatever, futurist fiction. But no, I mean, crime fiction for me, I mean, what interested me about crime fiction was I felt that literary fiction had begun to lose its meaning for me. It seemed to me that we were talking in a closed room to ourselves and patting ourselves on the back and feeling very happy and pleased with ourselves. And that didn't seem to me to be the purpose. I want to communicate with people, and I think genre fiction, whether it's chick lit or science fiction or fantasy or crime fiction, is a way of trying to communicate with another audience that would not normally assume that to read one of your books. So that's one of the reasons. Also, I also like crime fiction, and I enjoy writing it. So it becomes an addiction after a while. So that's really for me, that's the kind of idea, is to actually be able to reach another audience, to be able to publish more regularly, because I think that literature is becoming much more difficult to produce and sell, in a sense, literary fiction. It's a very, very, I mean, there's a huge amount published and produced and so forth, but it's a very narrow outlet. And I kind of feel I'm on safer ground with crime fiction.
It's interesting. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I might write literary fiction if I was good at it, but I don't think I'm particularly good at it. But in terms of my Muslim misery memoir, as it's referred to in Beautiful from this angle, the whole book came about because I have a French family through my husband, and there were many, many discussions over the years about. It was a genuine struggle for them to understand Pakistan, and there was a lot of concern about what Islam meant, what it meant in France, what it meant globally, and we constantly had conversations, and I kept getting asked, but why? Why do you wear the hijab? Why is that okay? Are all women oppressed? And by the end, I just got fed up, and I thought, okay, I'm going to address some of this in this book because I can't keep having this conversation. But also, I had read. So when I was a kid, I had this habit of picking up whatever books were lying around, and my aunt, in fact, she's here today, Nina, had Not Without My Daughter, by, which was this, and I read it quite young, which was this story
Betty
of
Mahmoudi.
Yes, yeah. of this woman who had a terrible experience in Iran and had to escape, and I wasn't intentionally making light of those kind of situations, but I just wanted to play with the idea of stereotypes of what happens in Islam and women and oppression. So I came up with this idea of a character within a book writing a book, a Muslim memoir where she was trying to sort of very cynically sell it to the West and make money from it by creating a fictional account of being trapped, leaving the UK and being trapped in a horrible marriage and her dog Fifi going missing. And so it was just meant to be a bit of a satirical kind of take on all these issues.
But as well, in a French magazine, you actually wrote a short non-fiction piece on the same subject about women and sort of stereotypes around their automatic oppression of people in the West, assuming that all Muslim women are the same and are oppressed. But I really like the quote you put. The issues, you weren't denying that there are problems for women, but you said, the issues that let women down in Pakistan are rampant corruption, deeply entrenched feudalism, tribalism, ethnic division, and even cultural legacy. So I just wonder if maybe you could both talk a little bit about sort of the quite dominant human rights discourse that comes through and kind of assumptions about, you mentioned earlier about, there's no contact with Muslims, we just don't understand these cultures, when actually there has been a lot of interchange and it isn't monolithic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that there's a lot of structural violence in the system. I don't think that is religion per se. I think that's just something that needs to be addressed over time. We're a young country. we're just building up our infrastructure. We have lots and lots of problems. I don't think, though, from a Western sort of point of view, you can blame a religion for what we are going through. And I think that was what I was trying to address. That I was watching Fox News at the time, and there are all these sound bites, and well, you should all watch Fox News just because it's so demented.
That's true.
But it's also really scary because you get these sound bites, these 2-minute sound bites that this is happening. And there was a day that I was in London when I was writing that book, and I went to the newsagents, and there was 4 headlines, and I'll never forget them on mainstream newspapers. And it was like, one of them was that there was a Pakistani British woman who was wearing a hijab and a full burqa and was teaching, and her students were upset because she was mumbling and she refused to unveil herself. There was another story about a Muslim man who got angry when he got in a taxi because the Muslim taxi driver, because a blind man was taking his dog, and the Muslim taxi driver said the dog was unclean, and so on and so forth. And it was sort of like rampantly everywhere. And I don't think those are the problems that we're facing as a country. I think they're deeply embedded issues that, that need to be tackled through governance, through institutions, through microfinance, through the work of non-governmental groups. So I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that narrative is helpful in terms of other people looking at the country.
Yeah, I think there's an obligation. I mean, I feel it's certainly an obligation to try and at least make this sort of complicate the narrative, as it were, to sound like an academic. In the sense that my experience of Sudan and Islam in Sudan is very different from the kind of monolithic, simplistic views that you often, meet in the West, both in the general kind of things you're talking about in the general media, but also, I think, astonishingly, surprisingly, in coming from people who should know better, academics, intellectuals, let's say, not academics so much, but intellectuals who are part of the intelligentsia, who can read and write, who have opinions. I think one of the great intellectual failures in the West, generally, to generalize, came after 9/11, when so-called principles about rationality and humanism and so many other things were really pushed into the back seat by a kind of very old-fashioned prejudice and stereotypes flooded in and were welcomed. People like Christopher Hitchens, for example, and this kind of view was praised and became and legitimized. And I think that this has really led to a kind of blind spot and an absence. It's made the conversation very one-sided. And so I think that people like myself have an obligation to try and keep throwing our weight behind the idea of complicating that.
Great, thank you. What else? I mean, I guess if we end where we began and then open it up to the audience for questions. So we were asked to talk about post-colonial writing, and you've complicated the narrative, as it were. So where do you see writing from people with backgrounds in formerly colonized countries, where do you see those kind of narratives and your own writing going in the next 10, 20 years?
So for me, after I do this nonfiction, I'm going to try my hand at a crime novel, but a true story, an archaeological thriller about something that happened in Karachi a decade ago. So I'm trying my hand. Let's see where we go. I'm really excited about fiction coming out of Pakistan. There's so many interesting things happening. There's an author in the audience today who's written about reimagined Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So we're having really fun, interesting, different approaches to fiction, and I'm just happy to get to be a part of that. I can't wait to kind of see what happens and what's gonna come out of Pakistan and elsewhere. And I think for me, I'm gonna stick to. I know I've done children's books and a bit of satire, but I think I'm gonna stick to thrillers and crime and see where I end up.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about coming to somewhere like Lahore or coming to a festival like this is that you are met with the existence of a literary world outside of the normal, what we think of as the central poles in the West, you know. And I think that is where we're going, and that things are moving outwards, and that people who have one foot in both camps, as it were, continue to feel an obligation to change both the places that they come from and the places that they're living. And that is leading us into a situation where hopefully we are getting towards a kind of global conversation about what's going on, and that we can then start to get to really changing issues. I mean, we were talking about you know, the situation with of women and so on in Sudan. In some ways has kind of gone backwards. In the 1960s, Sudan had a very strong women's movement. And some of the leading figures in Sudanese politics were women, and in the trade union movements in Sudan were women. And that has kind of gone backwards, particularly over the last 30 years. And I think that there's now a new generation of people who want to address that and challenge the kind of norms that came in. And so I think we're challenging norms, hopefully, on both fronts, both within the Sudan, within the West, you know, and and for literature, this is kind of important, that for literature to remain relevant, we have to keep doing that. And I think we have to keep really addressing in a fluid way what is actually happening now, which means staying in touch with what's going on the ground in both places. And sorry, and crime fiction is a really good way of doing it.
So
I get some tips.
I wonder if the audience have any questions. Yeah, Asif. So I've got one over here, but we'll go to the lady in the front first, just for, sorry, convenience.
Actually, mine is more for me to understand. You know, the colonizers left, but their language didn't. And what's happened is a majority of populations that were colonized, including us, because we're writing in English, we're sort of disenfranchising 95% of our population. Mm. That leads to other complications in every sphere, because everybody's aspiring to the language of the colonizer. So indigenous languages have taken a big hit. Mm. That's just a comment. I mean, I just wanted to know what you think about it.
I mean, I agree entirely. I wish I could write in Urdu, but I would never do a good job of it. I feel like we have to set up funding for this. We have to translate. We have a wealth of writing in our local languages. We have to get funding to translate those and bring them out into the world, and also encourage people.
Intellectually colonized, really.
I agree with you. Yes, I think that that's a problem for people like me, but I also think that I hope that will change.
I'm not sure. I mean, yes, we're colonized in the sense that we're using the language. I mean, I was you know, born in London and brought up in Sudan, but the school that I went to in Khartoum was teaching in English. So all of my education has been in English. There is now quite a sizable diaspora of Sudanese who've left Sudan over the last 30 years and live in the US, in Canada, in Europe, different parts of Europe, in Korea, in Japan, all over the world, Australia, all over the world. So these languages are no longer, you know, I wouldn't describe them as colonial languages anymore. It's something that we've inherited. I think that that we're changing those languages by using them to describe things that were not described before. But I think the other issue is the issue of languages. And that is an issue that is, in Africa, is a very serious issue, in the Middle East, you know, and over here, it's an important issue, because these languages do deserve and are important. It's important to preserve these languages and to keep them alive in some way. And what's interesting is if you go to Europe, you see that, for example, in France, where there was this politics back centuries ago to really dominate and have French spoken everywhere, there is now a pushback where people are now asking for their children to learn to speak Breton or to speak Occitan, you know, and people are going back to, in Wales, they're learning to speak Welsh. You know, everybody is trying to get back to something else because this generalization is not working and we're losing ourselves. And I think that English is a language of universal, you know, communication somehow. And we use that, but it doesn't mean, but we've almost colonized the language now. We're recolonizing the language, if you can say that. And I think that you know, my job is to point to people and say, there is writing in Sudan which you should be translating, you know. And I can only do that because I speak English. And nobody is going to go from London to go to Sudan and find those writers and translate them unless you tell them that there's something there worth looking for. So I think the language is, we have to take the language and we have to, you know, we have to use it.
Just to add that I think post-colonial academics have a heavy responsibility to try and bring in more languages and not be sort of confined to Anglophone bubble. So at York, I've got a module called Muslim Translations of Britain, which I have set myself a target that there's never less than 70% of the module has to be in other languages and only 30% in English. So we're looking at, and again, with this idea that there has been long connections between, in my case, Britain and the Muslim world. So I'm looking at travelogues, memoirs, and novels and short fiction from Urdu, Arabic, and Persian for the majority. And there's some great translations, many of which are free on archive.org or Gutenberg Project online, so easily accessible and cheap for students. So I think we all need to keep pushing this issue of translation.
But could I just add that, because my grandmother didn't speak Arabic. She spoke Rutana. She spoke the language of Nubia in the north of Sudan. And there's now a movement within the Nubian community in Khartoum to try and get Nubian taught in the schools. So it has to go back to the idea that the government recognizes that these languages are a valid and important part of the country's culture. And I think language and history are the two essential, geography also, but language and history are the two things that I really think we have to insist that they bring them back and it becomes an important area. Because if we can't respect the language and the culture within the country, we will never have the kind of stability and where we can thrive, you know.
So my question is more on the line of relationship with language, and I would like to ask Jamal to talk a bit about, more specifically, you did mention your relationship with the kind of literature which is being written in Sudan by people who are located there and are living there. And you also mentioned the work of Tayyip Saleh, and I wonder if you have a relationship or do you relate with that kind of literature? Have you ever thought of writing in Arabic or translating into or from Arabic, and how does that work out? Does that influence the kind of fiction you write, not in Arabic but in English?
Yeah, that's a long question. I have thought about writing in Arabic. My Arabic, if I wanted to write in Arabic, I would need to absolutely sit and focus on it to try. I mean, I find it hard enough to write in English. Which I've been doing for a long time. So to do it in Arabic, I would really have to sit down. I did, at a point, want to write a novel in Arabic about the Sudanese community in Cairo. This was in the 1990s. And I didn't do it. In the end, the idea morphed into writing an epic novel about Cairo, and then it morphed into a series of detective novels about Cairo. So I failed on that one. But in terms of the writing in Sudan, there has been over the last, despite the difficulties and despite the political crackdown and the on free speech, I mean, There is a thriving community. There are a lot of young writers who are inspired by all kinds of things and who are writing about their existence in Khartoum over the last 20, 30 years. And that is very heartening to see. And there are publishers who do risk a great deal, including their own liberty, to try and to keep these books in print. And that, I respect greatly. And I try to read those, and I try to stay in touch with those people to get an idea of what's happening there. But I think that there's a lot of writers who feel, one of this, to go back to the lady's question about the dominance of English, I think there has to be a kind of resistance to this idea of English being the universal language to some extent. We have to resist that in the sense that we have to allow for conferences where we can have people speaking who are on the same platform and speaking different languages. We shouldn't be afraid of that. And we should encourage the idea of conversation between English language writers and local languages, people who are writing in local languages. I think that would be of benefit to both sides. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, you have, except the Yep Saleh.
Oh, yeah, what was the type Saleh is about his books, or?
Yeah. Do you feel a kind of linkage or relationship with his work?
Well, yes. I mean, I read his books when I was a child. I read them in Arabic. I read them in English. And the book that is well known is The Season of Migration to the North, which is a very strange book in many ways and has some oddities in terms of its historical timeline. The time of period he's talking about when there wasn't that much contact with, there weren't that many Sudanese in Britain. So there are a lot of really odd points in that. But yeah, he's somebody who I think a lot of Sudanese writers, are trying to write from out, beyond his shadow, to get away from his shadow. Yeah, so I don't really.
Any more questions? Yes.
Sir, I understand the idea of writing back to empire, but how can we cross the cultural limitation of both languages, the language of oppressor and the language of oppressed?
I think Jamal just articulated it when he said that we should encourage more communication between writing in different languages, whether it's a local language or English. I think that's a great idea, to just encourage more communication between writers. And also I think it's because I personally think we should fund more writers writing in their own languages as well, and encourage translations.
I think we have to empower the local language. We have to, we have to do this, and it's not just here. It's also when I talked about. I mean, in West Africa, there are some very big languages, and in a lot of places in West Africa, people will speak 4 or 5 languages normally. And language is something. It's a really essential part of the human condition somehow, and it hasn't. People who are working in language and trying to protect languages often are working under very difficult circumstances with no funding and support. And I think this is a scandal and should change. But, English has become a dominant language, and in a way it's become a kind of monster. And so for me, I see that as a challenge. How do I use this English language to turn it around and turn it back? And I again, to the gentleman's point, when I was writing my one of my early novels, I think my second novel, I was trying to capture the experience of Sudanese students in Britain in the 1950s from conversations that I'd had with people, and the way that they used English with Arabic phrasing. So they would take an Arabic expression and just translate it literally, and how this just created a kind of confusion. My idea was to use it as a kind of comedy element. But I had great difficulty talking to the publishers who didn't understand what on earth I was doing, and had long arguments with the person who was editing my book, because she just simply didn't, there were a lot of phrases, and she said, but that doesn't mean anything. Well, yes, it does mean something, and we have to kind of, so we're getting somewhere. We're getting to the point where we can use, nowadays, you can use a non-English word without putting it in italics.
Or an index.
Sorry, so yeah, or you don't need a glossary. You don't need, if they don't understand, they'll be fine, and that is kind of, you have to take the editors, in London and just lead them by the hand and say, it's okay, it'll be all right. People will either get it or they won't get it, So in that way, we are sort of trying to transform the language of the oppressor, as you put it, and make it something else.
And we need to complicate that a little bit, the language of the oppressor. Would you say, English has become a monster, there is no doubt, but say African-American kids, like working class kids doing slam poetry in an urban version of English is very different, from like courtly Urdu. Urdu might be seen as an oppressor language. Certainly in 1971, the Bengalis thought so, and maybe Saraiki or Pashto poets today would see Urdu as not that much of a language of the oppressed. And similarly, your example of Arabic and Nubian is a good one. Arabic might be seen as a very dominant language. Yeah.
No, there are many parts of Sudan where Arabic is seen as the language of the oppressor.
Mm. Any other questions?
There's one here.
There's
Two.
My question is addressed to Maha. While discussing your work, you describe it as archaeological thriller, and you use this beautifully evocative work which is associated with literary activity of excavation. Many of the authors, they do what is termed as literary archaeological process or excavation. Do you think writers, writers find themselves under some kind of literary imperative when they are doing a project of historical import that it involves some kind of archaeological excavation?
So is the question, I think if I understand your question, is do you feel that it's important, imperative to get the history right in terms of archaeology? Is that what you were asking? I think writers, if you're going to write about a period of time, I think you do have to write about with some historical accuracy, or at least that's where I started writing about this book, and that limited me because I couldn't contain my book within the information that was available to me. So I think it depends how you position your writing, what you're trying to say, whether you're trying to be an authentic voice, whether you're clearly, in my case, writing in a sort of speculative sense. There simply wasn't the information available. So there's very, very little information when you start compiling all this stuff that's out there about the Indus Valley civilization and how people live and how people might have worked and what they ate. And I talked to several archaeologists, actually, and the thing that grounded it for me was the fact that Michael Janssen, who was sort of a lead director of the excavations in Mohenjo-Daro in the 80s and 70s and 80s, sort of said, well, if you look at the people of the region now, and you look at the people that live on boats now, and how they fish and how they, and what they eat, you probably won't find that a lot has changed. And so that for me was a great launching point, because I thought, I can deal with that. I can see what's happening already. And actually, there's images of Lakhana, and you see some of the brick houses, and they're not that different. So I sort of used what was out there and used it to sort of anchor myself a bit. But I didn't feel a responsibility to be accurate just because I couldn't be. There just wasn't the information there for me to be.
So the last question.
Hi, my name is Draz Georgic. I'm a journalist for Reuters, based here in Pakistan. One of the things you both talked about is free speech and freedoms and liberty and so on and so forth. And I wanted to ask you, in the current context, obviously what's happening in Sudan is well publicized. And Pakistan at the moment is going through another bout through its history where there is more restrictions on journalism, what people can write, what they can say. Where does books and literature, where does that fit in the kind of struggle for free speech and subversive writing in the age of social media and sort of, most of the young people in Pakistan now consuming their news on mobile phones? And where do you see your work and where do you see that going in the future? Because I think in the past, books were the sort of the main mediums of sort of subversive activity and bringing about change, certainly through intellectual sort of discourse. And I just wonder, where do you think that's going in the future?
I think it's even more important, actually, in an age where, again, coming back to this idea of sound bites, where it's easy to just pull a nugget of information. I think it's even more important where there's an information overload happening in the world. We get access information in so many different ways that we couldn't have even imagined when I was a child, for example. But writing, fiction, the world of books, I think will always play a very, very important part in how we access the human experience, how we talk about the world in which we inhabit. I don't think that will change. I think it's just a way of, I don't want to use the word safe space because it's such a terrible expression, but in the sense that books will always, and fiction will always provide access to bigger worlds, imagined worlds, and also a way of engaging with the places that we inhabit in a way that's unique to individuals. I think that's really important, and as technology increases, I think that becomes even more so, personally.
No, I think that's true. And I think that the social media is limited up to a certain point to what it can do. I mean, people in Sudan use social media. They connect on Facebook, whatever. But if you place restrictions on people culturally in terms of cultural expression for many years, people are hungry for just basically cultural material. And I think that you saw that in Egypt leading up to 2011. You saw a boom in activity, in theater activity, and also in young writers writing novels being published by a couple of very active publishers. And in Egypt, you buy one copy of a book will be circulated between 10 people. So the sales will not tell you how many people are reading that book. People feel that they find a connection, an expression in these books, which gives them a sense of some kind of solid foundation upon which they all can gather. And I think that played an important role in Egypt, and I think it's playing an important role in Sudan now. That there is, as I say, a group of young people who have been writing for over the last 10, 15 years, and sharing and meeting and passing books around and passing manuscripts around, because even if the book is not published, people will be passing a photocopied copy around, between them. So things like that are going on, and I think it's because there is this need to have some, there isn't anything. The state is controlling the media. There is in Sudan, for example, there are writers who are writing in favor of the regime. There are two writers' unions in Khartoum. One of them is official, which is in support of Omar al-Bashir and his people, and one is unofficial, and they will meet wherever, and they will connect through social media. But the two things, if you go there and say, I want to meet the writers' union, you will meet the other one. So there is a need in those kind of situations to create your own world. And I think literature has a very important part in that.
And I have thoughts as well, but I think we have to leave it there. So let's thank both our writers who've been amazing. That's great. Thank you for coming.